This is Rise, where truth is uncovered and black stories rise from silence to strength. Real voices, bold truth, unshakable legacy. Welcome to Rise. What if I told you that a black woman who built a multi-million-dollar bank from nothing was kicked out of her own boardroom by the very people she trusted most? Have you ever poured your heart into something, only to have those closest to you turn their backs when you needed them most? Have you ever been the only person who looked like you in a room full of decision makers? This is the story of Latrice Monroe, a visionary CEO who dared to challenge the banking industry's status quo, only to face the ultimate betrayal from within. But what happened next will shock you and might just change corporate America forever. On that fateful autumn morning, Latrice Monroe walked through the glass doors of Courage Capital Bank with the same confidence that had carried her through countless boardroom battles. The 42-year-old CEO moved with purpose, her heels clicking against the marble floor of the institution she had built from the ground up. The banking world knew her as a revolutionary, the black woman who had transformed a struggling financial startup into one of the most innovative banks in the country. But success in corporate America can be a dangerous thing, especially when you're breaking barriers that others never wanted broken. Latrice had no idea that within hours, the very empire she had constructed would turn against her. The colleagues she had mentored, the board members she had trusted, the institution that bore her vision, all of it was about to crumble in the most devastating way possible. For nearly a decade, Courage Capital Bank had been more than just a financial institution. It was a symbol of hope for underserved communities, a beacon of ethical banking practices, and proof that doing the right thing could also be profitable. Under Latrice's leadership, the bank had grown from a small community lender to a regional powerhouse, serving thousands of families who had been ignored by traditional banks. The numbers spoke for themselves. Customer satisfaction ratings consistently topped 95%. Community investment had increased by 400% under her tenure. The bank's innovative lending programs had helped launch over 2,000 small businesses in predominantly black neighborhoods. Financial publications had featured Latrice on their covers, calling her the future of banking and the CEO who's changing everything. But success breeds envy, and change threatens those who profit from the status quo. What made Latrice's leadership so revolutionary wasn't just her financial acumen, though her MBA from Wharton and her track record spoke volumes. It was her unwavering commitment to transparency, her refusal to engage in the predatory practices that had plagued the industry for decades, and her bold vision of what banking could be when it truly served people instead of just shareholders. She had transformed boardroom meetings from sterile discussions about profit margins into passionate debates about community impact. She had replaced the bank's traditional loan officers with counselors who actually helped families understand their financial options. She had created mentorship programs that paired successful entrepreneurs with aspiring business owners, regardless of their background or credit score. If stories of resilience inspire you, smash that like button right now, because what you're about to hear will test everything you thought you knew about corporate loyalty. The banking industry had never seen anything like Latrice Monroe. While other CEOs focused on quarterly earnings and stock prices, she was building something sustainable, something meaningful. Her approach was unconventional, yes, but it was working. The bank's growth trajectory was unprecedented, and its impact on local communities was undeniable. Yet in the shadows of her success, a storm was forming. The same boardroom that had once celebrated her achievements was now questioning her every decision. The same colleagues who had praised her innovation were now whispering about her unconventional methods. The same investors who had profited from her vision were now concerned about her radical approach to banking. You see, there's something about corporate America that many people don't understand. It's not enough to be successful. You have to be successful in the right way, according to the right people, following the right rules. And Latrice Monroe had committed the ultimate corporate sin. She had succeeded while being unapologetically herself. She had refused to tone down her passion during board meetings. She had declined to water down her vision to appease traditional investors. She had chosen to prioritize long-term community impact over short-term profits. In the eyes of some, these weren't strengths. They were threats. The woman who had once been celebrated as a trailblazer was now being painted as a liability. The same qualities that had made her successful were now being used against her. Her commitment to transparency was labeled as lack of discretion. Her community focus was dismissed as mission drift. Her innovative approaches were criticized as risky deviations. As Latrice prepared for what she thought would be a routine board meeting that morning, she had no idea that her entire world was about to change. The agenda looked standard: quarterly review, strategic planning, budget approvals. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that would suggest the ambush that was waiting for her. The tragedy wasn't just what was about to happen to Latrice Monroe. It was what it represented. The systematic destruction of a leader who had dared to challenge the way things had always been done. This wasn't just about one woman or one bank. This was about power, control, and the lengths that some people will go to maintain the status quo. The boardroom that had once been her sanctuary was about to become her battlefield. The colleagues who had once been her allies were about to become her adversaries. The institution that had once been her pride was about to become her prison. But Latrice Monroe wasn't just any CEO. She was a fighter, a visionary, and a woman who had overcome obstacles that would have broken lesser leaders. What her opponents didn't realize was that their betrayal wouldn't destroy her. It would transform her into something far more powerful than they could have ever imagined. To understand the magnitude of what was about to happen to Latrice Monroe, you need to understand where she came from. This wasn't just any CEO about to face betrayal. This was a woman who had climbed mountains that most people wouldn't even attempt to scale. Latrice grew up in East Cleveland, in a neighborhood where dreams often died before they had a chance to take root. Her mother worked double shifts at a textile factory while her father drove a city bus, both of them determined to give their daughter opportunities they never had. The Monroe household wasn't wealthy, but it was rich in something far more valuable: the unshakable belief that education and hard work could change everything. While her classmates were planning weekend parties, Latrice was studying for advanced placement exams. While others were content with average grades, she was pushing herself toward excellence. Her guidance counselor told her that banking was a difficult field for people like her, but Latrice heard that as a challenge rather than a warning. She earned a full scholarship to Ohio State University, where she double majored in finance and economics while working part-time at a local credit union. It was there, helping families navigate their first home loans and small business applications, that she discovered her true calling. Banking wasn't just about numbers. It was about changing lives. After graduating summa cum laude, Latrice landed a position at a prestigious investment firm in New York City. She was often the only Black woman in meetings, the only one whose voice carried the weight of her community's experiences. While her colleagues networked at exclusive country clubs, she was sending money home to help her parents pay medical bills. The corporate world tested her in ways that textbooks never could. She endured microaggressions disguised as mentorship. She watched less qualified colleagues receive promotions while she was told she needed more seasoning. She sat in boardrooms where decisions were made that would impact communities like hers, but no one in those rooms had ever lived in those communities. But every slight, every overlooked promotion, every condescending comment only fueled her determination. Latrice wasn't just building a career. She was building a case for why the financial industry needed to change. After earning her MBA from Wharton, graduating at the top of her class, She returned to Cleveland with a revolutionary idea. What if there was a bank that actually served the people who needed it most? What if financial services could be both profitable and principled? What if banking could be a force for community empowerment rather than exploitation? In 2014, with $2 million in seed funding and a team of 5 dedicated employees, Latrice launched Courage Capital Bank. The name wasn't chosen randomly. It took courage to challenge an industry that had been operating the same way for decades. It took courage to prioritize people over profits. It took courage to believe that doing the right thing was also good business. The bank's mission was clear: to provide fair, transparent financial services to underserved communities while maintaining the highest standards of ethical banking. No predatory lending, no hidden fees, no discriminatory practices, just honest banking that helped people build wealth instead of drowning in debt. Latrice's approach was revolutionary. Instead of traditional loan officers who were trained to find reasons to say no, she hired financial counselors who were trained to find ways to say yes. Instead of one-size-fits-all products, she created customized solutions for each community's unique needs. Instead of profit-maximizing algorithms, she used human judgment and community knowledge. The results were extraordinary. Within 2 years, Courage Capital Bank had processed over $50 million in community loans. Small businesses that had been rejected by every other bank were thriving with Latrice's support. Families who had been trapped in cycles of debt were building generational wealth for the first time. The bank's innovative programs became models for the industry. Their Second Chance initiative helped people with poor credit rebuild their financial lives. Their Community Champions program provided zero-interest loans to local nonprofits. Their Future Leaders Scholarship Fund sent dozens of students to college. Major financial publications took notice. Forbes named Latrice one of their 30 under 30 in finance. The Wall Street Journal featured her innovative lending practices. Bloomberg called her the CEO who's revolutionizing community banking. Harvard Business School invited her to speak about ethical leadership. But the real validation came from the communities she served. Churches held special services to honor her work. Community centers displayed her photo alongside civil rights leaders. Parents named their daughters after her. She had become more than a CEO. She was a symbol of what was possible when someone refused to accept the status quo. By 2019, Courage Capital Bank had grown to $500 million in assets. They had opened 12 branches across Ohio and Michigan. Their customer satisfaction ratings were the highest in the region. Their loan default rates were among the lowest in the industry. Latrice had proven that ethical banking wasn't just morally right, it was financially smart. The banking industry was forced to take notice. Competitors began copying her programs. Regulators praised her transparency. Investors lined up to fund her expansion. Latrice Monroe had done the impossible. She had changed the game while winning at it. She was invited to speak at the Federal Reserve. She testified before Congress about banking reform. She served on the boards of major financial institutions. The girl from East Cleveland who had been told banking wasn't for people like her was now helping to shape the future of the entire industry. Her success was undeniable, her impact immeasurable, and her vision transformative. Latrice Monroe had built something that would outlast her, something that would continue changing lives long after she was gone. But success in corporate America can be a double-edged sword. The higher you climb, the more visible you become. The more you change, the more resistance you face. The more successful you are, the more threatened others feel. Latrice was about to learn that being right isn't always enough, especially when being right challenges people who have been wrong for decades. Drop a comment if you've ever felt like an outsider in your workplace, because what Latrice faced next will resonate with anyone who has ever dared to be different. Success has a way of making people uncomfortable, especially when that success challenges everything they thought they knew about how things should work. For Latrice Monroe, the first signs of trouble weren't loud or obvious. They were subtle shifts in tone, small changes in body language, and the kind of quiet resistance that grows in boardrooms when powerful people feel threatened. The transformation didn't happen overnight. For years, Courage Capital Bank's board meetings had been collaborative affairs where Latrice's vision was celebrated and her leadership was unquestioned. But as the bank's success grew, so did the scrutiny. What had once been praised as innovative thinking was now being questioned as risky behavior. What had once been celebrated as community focus was now being criticized as mission drift. The shift began with Harold Brennan, a seasoned banker who had joined the board 2 years earlier. Brennan represented old-school finance, the kind of man who believed that banking should be predictable, conservative, and profitable above all else. He had initially supported Latrice's appointment, seeing her as a fresh face who could bring new energy to the institution. But as her influence grew, his comfort level diminished. During board meetings, Brennan's questions became more pointed. Instead of asking, "How can we support this initiative?" he was asking, "What are the risks we haven't considered?" Instead of celebrating the bank's community impact, he was questioning whether those programs were sustainable in the long term. Margaret Hoffman, another board member with deep ties to traditional banking circles, began echoing Brennan's concerns. She had been one of Latrice's early supporters, but her enthusiasm had cooled as the bank's unconventional approaches gained national attention. Hoffman worried that Courage Capital was becoming too political and straying from its core mission of profitability. The boardroom dynamics were shifting in ways that made Latrice's position increasingly precarious. Conversations that had once been warm and supportive became formal and guarded. Decisions that had once been unanimous now required lengthy debates. Support that had once been automatic now had to be earned through careful negotiation. You see, there's something dangerous about corporate boardrooms. They can turn from sanctuaries into battlegrounds faster than you can imagine. What made the situation particularly insidious was how the opposition disguised itself as legitimate concern. No one was openly challenging Latrice's competence or questioning her right to lead. Instead, they were raising important questions about governance, expressing healthy skepticism about new initiatives, and advocating for prudent oversight of the bank's operations. The coded language was unmistakable to anyone who understood corporate politics. When Brennan suggested that the bank needed more seasoned leadership for its next phase of growth, everyone knew what he meant. When Hoffman questioned whether Latrice's aggressive expansion was sustainable, the subtext was clear. When other board members nodded in agreement with these concerns, the battle lines were being drawn. Latrice wasn't naive. She had navigated corporate politics long enough to recognize when the winds were changing. She could feel the shift in energy when she entered the boardroom. She noticed how conversations would pause when she approached, how her suggestions were met with skepticism rather than enthusiasm, how her successes were being overshadowed by manufactured concerns. The attacks weren't just professional, they were personal. Board members began questioning her communication style, suggesting that she was too emotional in her presentations. They criticized her decision-making process, claiming that she was too impulsive in her leadership approach. They even questioned her commitment to the bank's mission, implying that she was using her position to advance her own agenda rather than serving shareholders. What hurt most was watching allies become adversaries. Robert Chun, a board member who had mentored Latrice during her early days, began distancing himself from her initiatives. Patricia Williams, who had once praised Latrice's innovative approaches, was now expressing concerns about regulatory compliance and fiduciary responsibility. The isolation was becoming unbearable. Board meetings that had once energized Latrice were now exhausting battles where she had to defend every decision, justify every success, and explain every deviation from traditional banking practices. She was fighting a war on multiple fronts, and the casualties were mounting. External pressures were building as well. Competitors who had once tried to poach Latrice's talent were now spreading rumors about Courage Capital's unstable leadership. Industry publications that had once celebrated her innovations were now publishing articles questioning her unconventional methods. Regulatory agencies that had once praised her transparency were now conducting routine inspections with increasing frequency. The stress was taking its toll. Latrice's team noticed that she was working longer hours, taking fewer vacations, and showing signs of strain that hadn't been there before. The woman who had once thrived on challenges was now being worn down by constant combat. But Latrice had no idea what was coming next. The opposition wasn't just growing, it was organizing. Board members who had once operated independently were now coordinating their efforts. Private conversations were happening outside of official meetings. Strategies were being developed to systematically undermine her authority. The very people who had benefited from her success were now plotting her downfall. The irony was staggering. Latrice Monroe, who had dedicated her career to serving others, was being betrayed by the very people she had served. The institution she had built was being turned against her. The boardroom she had transformed was becoming her prison. What made the situation even more tragic was how predictable it all was. This wasn't the first time a successful Black woman had faced resistance from within her own organization. It wasn't the first time innovation had been punished rather than rewarded. It wasn't the first time excellence had been met with envy rather than admiration. The signs were all there for anyone who knew how to read them. The subtle shifts in language, the gradual erosion of support, the systematic questioning of her authority. It was all building towards something devastating. Little did she know, the very people she trusted were about to attempt her complete destruction. The storm clouds were gathering, and Latrice Monroe was standing directly in their path. October 15th, 2023. The date that would forever change Latrice Monroe's life started like any other Tuesday morning. She arrived at Courage Capital Bank at 7:30 a.m., her usual time, carrying the confidence of a woman who had built an empire from nothing. The agenda for the 9 a.m. board meeting looked routine: quarterly performance review, strategic planning discussion, and budget approvals for the upcoming fiscal year. Latrice had prepared meticulously, as always. The bank's numbers were outstanding. Customer satisfaction was at an all-time high. Community impact metrics exceeded every target. Loan performance was stellar. She had every reason to expect another successful board meeting where her leadership would be celebrated and her vision would be validated. She walked into the boardroom with the same steady confidence that had carried her through countless challenges. Her presentation materials were perfectly organized. Her talking points were clear and compelling. Her passion for the bank's mission was as strong as ever. She greeted each board member with genuine warmth, just as she had done hundreds of times before. But something was different. The usual pre-meeting chatter was absent. Board members weren't making eye contact the way they normally did. The energy felt heavy, charged with an undercurrent of tension that made her instincts flare. Harold Brennan's greeting was curt. Margaret Hoffman's smile seemed forced. Even Robert Chun, who had always been a source of support, appeared uncomfortable. Latrice took her seat at the head of the conference table, the same seat she had occupied for nearly a decade. The same seat where she had announced the bank's first major expansion. The same seat where she had celebrated their community impact milestones. The same seat where she had led countless strategic discussions about the bank's future. She had no idea it would be the last time she would sit there as CEO. "Good morning, everyone," Latrice began, her voice carrying its usual authority. "I'm excited to share our quarterly results with you. As you'll see, we've exceeded projections in every category." Harold Brennan cleared his throat. "Actually, Latrice, we need to discuss some urgent matters before we get to the quarterly report." The room fell silent. Every board member's attention was focused on Brennan, as if they were all waiting for something they already knew was coming. Latrice felt the first flutter of concern, but she maintained her composure. "Of course," she replied. "What would you like to discuss?" What happened next was a masterclass in corporate assassination. Brennan pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the table with deliberate precision. Over the past several months, this board has been conducting a thorough review of your leadership and the bank's operations. We've discovered several concerning patterns that require immediate attention. Latrice's heart began to race, but she kept her expression neutral. "What kind of patterns?" "Patterns of financial mismanagement," Margaret Hoffman interjected, her voice cold and clinical. "Unauthorized expenditures, failure to secure proper board approval for major initiatives, and a concerning lack of transparency in your decision-making process." The words hit Latrice like physical blows. Financial mismanagement? Unauthorized expenditures? Lack of transparency? These were the exact opposite of everything she had built her career on. These were the antithesis of who she was as a leader. "I'm sorry, what?" Latrice's voice carried a note of disbelief. "Can you be more specific about these allegations?" Robert Chun, the man who had once mentored her, pulled out his own set of documents. "The board has documented multiple instances where you've exceeded your authority as CEO. The community outreach programs you've implemented, the lending criteria you've modified, the staffing decisions you've made, all of these required board approval that was never obtained." The room was closing in around her. Latrice realized that this wasn't a discussion, it was a trial, and she was the defendant. Every board member had come prepared with documentation, with accusations, with evidence of her supposed failures. This had been planned, coordinated, and executed with military precision. "These programs have been wildly successful," Latrice said, her voice growing stronger as she fought back. "Our community impact has never been higher. Our financial performance is exceptional. Our customer satisfaction ratings are industry-leading. Success doesn't excuse insubordination," Brennan replied curtly. "A CEO who operates without proper oversight is a liability, regardless of short-term results." Patricia Williams, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "The board has also received reports about your management style. Multiple staff members have expressed concerns about your aggressive approach to leadership." Aggressive approach? Latrice had always prided herself on being a collaborative leader, someone who inspired rather than intimidated. The accusation was so far from reality that it felt like she was being accused of crimes committed by someone else entirely. "I'd like to see these reports," Latrice said firmly. "I'd like to know which staff members have made these allegations." "That information is confidential," Hoffman replied. "But the pattern is clear. Your leadership style has created a hostile work environment that this board can no longer ignore." The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't about her performance. It was about her power. This wasn't about her management style. It was about her identity. This wasn't about the bank's success. It was about her refusing to conform to their expectations of how a CEO should behave. Brennan opened another folder. "Based on our investigation, this board has reached a unanimous decision." Unanimous. The word echoed in Latrice's mind. Every single person in this room had voted against her. Every single person she had trusted had betrayed her. Every single person she had worked alongside had turned their back on her. Effective immediately, you are being removed from your position as CEO of Courage Capital Bank. Your employment with this institution is terminated. You have 1 hour to gather your personal belongings and surrender all company property. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Latrice felt the world tilting beneath her feet. The woman who had built this institution from nothing was being thrown out like yesterday's trash. The leader who had transformed thousands of lives was being discarded like a failed experiment. "This is unconscionable," Latrice said, her voice trembling with rage, and disbelief. This bank exists because of my vision. These communities trust us because of my leadership. You can't just dash. The decision has been made. Brennan cut her off. Security will escort you to your office to collect your belongings. Your access to all systems and facilities will be terminated within the hour. The betrayal was complete. The woman who had given everything to this institution was being treated like a criminal. The CEO who had revolutionized community banking was being marched out under armed guard. The leader who had inspired countless others was being humiliated in front of the very people she had trusted most. As security appeared at the boardroom door, Latrice realized that this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every black woman who had ever dared to lead. This was about every innovator who had ever challenged the status quo. This was about every visionary who had ever refused to compromise their principles. They had taken her position, but they hadn't broken her spirit. They had stolen her company, but they hadn't destroyed her legacy. They had betrayed her trust, but they hadn't silenced her voice. The fight was just beginning. If this made you angry, you're not alone. Let me know in the comments how this betrayal makes you feel. The security escort to her office was the longest walk of Latrice Monroe's life. Each step felt like a public execution, with employees watching in stunned silence as their beloved CEO was marched out like a common criminal. The woman who had built their careers, who had fought for their advancement, who had created an environment where they could thrive, she was being discarded like waste. Latrice's hands trembled as she packed her personal belongings into cardboard boxes. Family photos, awards, the handwritten thank you notes from community members, all of it reduced to mere possessions that could fit in a few containers. The office that had been her sanctuary for nearly a decade now felt like a tomb. Her assistant, Maya Rodriguez, stood in the doorway with tears streaming down her face. "This isn't right," she whispered, her voice breaking. "None of this is right." Latrice paused, a framed photo of her parents in her hands. "Maya, I need you to do something for me. Contact Marcus Tillman at Tillman & Associates. Tell him I need to see him immediately. Today." Maya nodded through her tears. "Of course. Anything you need." The news of Latrice's termination spread through the bank like wildfire. Employees gathered in small groups, whispering in disbelief. The woman who had transformed their workplace, who had given them purpose beyond profit, was gone. The leader who had made them proud to work in banking had been cast aside. Junior Loan Officer David Patterson summed up the collective sentiment. "She's the reason I stayed in this industry. She's the reason I believed banking could be a force for good. Without her, what are we even doing here?" The emotional toll was devastating. Department heads who had thrived under Latrice's leadership were questioning their own futures. Community outreach coordinators were wondering if their programs would survive. The diversity and inclusion initiatives that had made Courage Capital a model for other institutions were now in jeopardy. Meanwhile, in the boardroom, the aftermath wasn't as celebratory as some members had expected. Harold Brennan sat in silence, staring at the empty chair where Latrice had sat just hours earlier. Margaret Hoffman shuffled through papers, avoiding eye contact with her colleagues. The weight of what they had done was settling in. Robert Chin was the first to break the silence. "I hope we know what we've done," he said quietly. "That woman built this institution. She made us relevant. She made us profitable. She made us respected. She also made us vulnerable," Brennan replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "A CEO who operates without proper oversight is a liability." "A liability?" Chen's voice rose. "She generated more positive press for this bank than any marketing campaign ever could. She brought us customers, capital, and credibility. And we just threw it all away." The boardroom fell silent again, each member wrestling with their own doubts about the decision they had made. Outside the bank, the community was reeling. News of Latrice's termination had reached the local media, and the reaction was swift and angry. Community leaders who had worked with her for years were demanding answers. Small business owners who had benefited from her programs were organizing protests. Churches that had partnered with the bank were reconsidering their relationships. Reverend James Washington, whose congregation had been one of the bank's earliest supporters, didn't mince words. Latrice Monroe was a blessing to this community. She gave opportunities to people who had been ignored by every other bank. If they can discard someone like her, what does that say about their commitment to us? The hashtag Justice for Latrice began trending on social media within hours. Videos of community members sharing their stories about how Latrice had helped them went viral. The narrative was clear. A champion of the people had been silenced by the very institution she had built. Sometimes the greatest injustices spark the most powerful revolutions. At her home that evening, Latrice sat in her study, surrounded by the boxes from her office. The silence was deafening after years of constant activity, endless meetings, and the energy of leading a growing institution. For the first time in her career, she felt truly alone. But solitude has a way of clarifying purpose. As the shock began to wear off, something else emerged, a burning determination that had carried her through every obstacle in her life. They had taken her position, but they hadn't taken her power. They had stripped her of her title, but they hadn't stripped her of her truth. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Tillman. "I've reviewed the preliminary information. This is bigger than wrongful termination. This is discrimination, pure and simple. We need to talk immediately." Marcus Tillman wasn't just any attorney. He was a legal warrior who had built his reputation defending executives who had been pushed out for challenging the status quo. His track record was impeccable, and his commitment to justice was unwavering. When Latrice arrived at his office at 8 p.m., she found a war room. Marcus had assembled a team of attorneys, investigators, and strategic advisors. The conference table was covered with documents, legal precedents, and a timeline of events leading up to her termination. "Latrice," Marcus said, his voice filled with controlled fury, "what happened to you today wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. The pattern of behavior, the pretextual accusations, the systematic undermining of your authority, this is textbook discrimination." Attorney Aisha Cole, a specialist in employment law, leaned forward. "We've identified at least 6 potential violations of your employment contract, 3 instances of procedural misconduct, and a clear pattern of racial and gender bias. They made a mistake by documenting so much of their opposition to your leadership style." Latrice felt something she hadn't felt since the morning: hope. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by systems designed to maintain power in the hands of the few. "What do you recommend?" she asked. Marcus smiled grimly. "We fight back. Hard." But what her legal team did next sent shockwaves through corporate America. Marcus Tillman had built his legal career on cases that others considered unwinnable. He specialized in corporate discrimination suits that required not just legal expertise, but strategic brilliance and unwavering courage. When he reviewed the details of Latrice Monroe's termination, he saw something that made his blood boil: a textbook case of systemic bias disguised as corporate governance. Working through the night, Marcus and his team dissected every board meeting transcript, every email exchange, every performance review from the past 2 years. What they found was a pattern of discrimination so clear, so documented, and so damaging that it would shake the foundations of corporate America. "Look at this," Aisha Cole said, pointing to a series of internal communications between board members. "They're questioning her aggressive leadership style and emotional decision-making. These are classic gender-based criticisms that are never applied to male CEOs." The legal team identified 17 separate instances where Latrice's actions were characterized using language that had clear racial and gender undertones. Her passion was labeled as excessive emotionalism. Her community focus was dismissed as politically motivated. Her innovative approaches were criticized as reckless departures from established protocols. Marcus knew they had more than just a wrongful termination case. They had a civil rights violation that could redefine how corporate boards operate. The strategy was ambitious, unprecedented, and absolutely necessary. At 6 a.m. on October 16th, just 18 hours after Latrice's termination, Marcus Tillman filed a federal lawsuit against Courage Capital Bank that would change everything. The complaint was 47 pages of meticulously documented evidence, legal precedents, and constitutional arguments that painted a devastating picture of institutional discrimination. The lawsuit alleged multiple violations: wrongful termination based on racial and gender discrimination, breach of fiduciary duty by board members, violation of employment contracts, and conspiracy to damage Latrice's professional reputation. But the most explosive allegation was the claim that the board had systematically undermined her authority specifically because she was a Black woman who refused to conform to their expectations of submissive leadership. The complaint included recorded statements from board meetings where members questioned whether Latrice was the right fit for leading the bank through its next phase of growth. It documented how her innovative programs were consistently characterized as risky, while identical programs at other institutions were praised as forward-thinking. Most damaging of all, the lawsuit revealed that Harold Brennan had privately told another board member that Latrice was too independent and needed to be brought under control. The implication was clear. A Black woman CEO who refused to be controlled was seen as a threat that needed to be eliminated. The legal filing was just the beginning. Marcus knew that winning in court was only half the battle. They needed to win in the court of public opinion as well. At 2 p.m. that same day, he held a press conference that would dominate news cycles for weeks. The conference room at the Marriott downtown was packed with reporters, cameras, and industry analysts. Marcus stood at the podium with Latrice beside him, both of them radiating the kind of controlled fury that comes from witnessing gross injustice. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority, "what happened to Latrice Monroe yesterday was not just an attack on one exceptional leader. It was an attack on the very principles of equality and fairness that our society claims to uphold." He methodically laid out the evidence, each revelation more damaging than the last. The packed room fell silent as he detailed how board members had used coded language to mask their discriminatory intent. He showed how Latrice's performance metrics contradicted every allegation made against her. He demonstrated how the termination process violated the bank's own governance protocols. "This lawsuit is not just about seeking justice for Latrice Monroe," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "This is about sending a message to every corporate board in America that discrimination will not be tolerated, that bias will not be ignored, and that exceptional leaders will not be silenced because they refuse to conform to outdated expectations." The press conference lasted 90 minutes. With Marcus and Latrice fielding questions from reporters who seemed shocked by the depth of evidence they had uncovered. When asked about her goals for the lawsuit, Latrice's response was powerful and unforgettable. "I'm not doing this for revenge. I'm doing this for every Black woman who has ever walked into a boardroom and been told her leadership style was too aggressive. I'm doing this for every innovator who has been punished for challenging the status quo. I'm doing this for every leader who has been silenced because they refuse to accept that this is how we've always done things." The media response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the story was trending on every major news platform. CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News all led their evening broadcasts with coverage of the lawsuit. The Wall Street Journal called it a potential watershed moment for corporate governance. The New York Times described it as the discrimination case that could reshape American business. Industry experts were divided but engaged. Dr. Patricia Williams, a corporate governance expert at Columbia Business School, called the lawsuit long overdue. She noted that the evidence presented suggests a pattern of behavior that goes far beyond normal corporate disagreements. However, some industry insiders pushed back. Former banking executive William Crawford argued that boards have the right to make leadership changes based on their assessment of what's best for the institution. But even critics acknowledged that the documented evidence was troubling. Social media exploded with support for Latrice. The hashtag Justice for Latrice gained over 2 million mentions in the first 24 hours. Videos of the press conference were shared hundreds of thousands of times. Community leaders, business executives, and ordinary citizens rallied behind her cause. This wasn't just about one woman. This was about changing the entire system. The legal papers had been filed, the evidence had been presented, and the battle lines had been drawn. Corporate America was about to face a reckoning that would force every institution to examine its own practices and confront the uncomfortable truth about bias in leadership. The response to Latrice Monroe's press conference was unlike anything the corporate world had seen in decades. Within hours of Marcus Tillman's devastating presentation, social media platforms became battlegrounds for justice. The hashtag Justice for Latrice exploded across Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn, generating over 5 million interactions in the first 48 hours. But this wasn't just online activism. It was a full-scale mobilization of communities, organizations, and individuals who had been waiting for someone to stand up and fight back against systemic discrimination in corporate America. The National Association of Professional Women issued a statement calling Latrice's termination a stark reminder of the barriers that continue to face women of color in leadership positions. Their president, Dr. Angela Martinez, didn't hold back. What happened to Latrice Monroe is what happens to exceptional Black women every day in boardrooms across America. The only difference is that she has the courage and resources to fight back. The Executive Leadership Council, representing senior-level Black executives, pledged financial support for Latrice's legal battle. CEO Raymond Thompson declared, "This case represents every Black executive who has been told they're too aggressive, too emotional, or not the right fit. We will not allow this injustice to stand." Community organizations in Cleveland and Detroit organized rallies that drew thousands of supporters. Small business owners whose dreams had been realized through Courage Capital's programs stood up to share their stories. Church congregations that had partnered with the bank held prayer vigils. Local politicians demanded investigations into discriminatory practices at financial institutions. The support transcended racial and gender lines. White male executives began sharing their own stories of witnessing discrimination in their organizations. Former Courage Capital employees created a private Facebook group that grew to over 2,000 members within days, all sharing testimonials about Latrice's leadership and the positive impact she had on their careers. This is what happens when courage meets community. Corporate governance experts began dissecting the case with the intensity of Supreme Court scholars analyzing a landmark decision. Harvard Business School professor Dr. Michael Chen called it a perfect storm of documented discrimination that could fundamentally change how boards operate. The term glass cliff entered mainstream conversation as experts explained how women and minorities are often placed in leadership positions during times of crisis, only to be blamed when external forces create challenges. Dr. Sarah Kim, author of Breaking Boardroom Barriers, noted that Latrice Monroe's case exemplifies this phenomenon. She was celebrated when the bank was growing, but attacked when board members decided her success threatened their control. The legal implications were staggering. Employment attorneys across the country began reaching out to clients who had experienced similar treatment. Law schools added the case to their curricula as an example of how discrimination lawsuits could be effectively structured and presented. Most significantly, other corporations began preemptively reviewing their own practices. Within a week of the lawsuit's filing, 3 major companies announced new diversity and inclusion initiatives. 2 regional banks implemented mandatory bias training for board members. A Fortune 500 company hired its first chief diversity officer specifically to prevent situations like Latrice's termination. The financial industry felt the pressure most acutely. Banking regulators began scrutinizing leadership transitions more closely. The Federal Reserve announced that it would be conducting a comprehensive review of diversity practices at federally chartered banks. Industry conferences hastily added panels on preventing discrimination in corporate governance. Media coverage intensified as investigative journalists began examining similar cases at other institutions. The Washington Post published a series on the CEO glass cliff, documenting how women and minority executives were systematically pushed out of leadership positions. Bloomberg analyzed board composition data, showing that companies with diverse leadership consistently outperformed those with homogeneous boards. Celebrity endorsements began pouring in. Oprah Winfrey tweeted her support, calling Latrice a warrior for justice who refuses to be silenced. Business mogul Robert Johnson pledged to match donations to Latrice's legal defense fund. Even international leaders weighed in, with the CEO of a major European bank calling the case a test of America's commitment to equality. The economic impact was immediate and substantial. Courage Capital Bank's stock price dropped 15% in the first week following the lawsuit. 3 major institutional investors announced they were reviewing their positions. Customer withdrawals exceeded $50 million as account holders protested the board's actions. Board members who had seemed so confident in their decision began facing personal and professional consequences. Harold Brennan's membership at an exclusive country club was suspended pending an investigation. Margaret Hoffman was quietly asked to step down from 2 nonprofit boards. The reputational damage was spreading beyond the bank to every institution associated with the board members. But the most powerful response came from Latrice herself. In a video message posted on social media, she spoke directly to the millions of people following her story. "I am overwhelmed by the support you have shown me. But I want you to know that this fight is not about me. It's about us. It's about every person who has been told they don't belong in leadership. It's about every innovator who has been silenced for challenging the status quo. It's about every dreamer who has been told their vision is too bold, too different, too threatening to the way things have always been done." Her words resonated across all demographics. The video was viewed over 10 million times in the first week. Comments poured in from people sharing their own stories of discrimination, their own experiences with bias, their own dreams of creating positive change. But the real victory was just beginning. The revolution wasn't just about one lawsuit or one woman. It was about a fundamental shift in how society viewed corporate accountability. Board members across the country were suddenly aware that their decisions would be scrutinized, their biases would be challenged, and their actions would have consequences. The case was becoming a catalyst for systemic change. Corporate America was being forced to confront uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and the systems that perpetuate inequality. The revolution had begun, and there was no going back. Subscribe if you believe in fighting for justice, because this story is far from over. 6 months after that devastating boardroom betrayal, Latrice Monroe stood before a packed auditorium at Howard University, delivering the keynote address at their annual Leadership Excellence Conference. The woman who had once been discarded by her own board was now being celebrated as a catalyst for change across corporate America. The transformation was remarkable. What had started as a personal attack on one exceptional leader had evolved into a movement that was reshaping how businesses operated nationwide. The lawsuit was still pending, but its impact was already being felt in boardrooms from Wall Street to Silicon Valley. Corporate America was changing, and Latrice Monroe was leading that change. Major corporations began implementing new governance protocols specifically designed to prevent discrimination in leadership transitions. The Monroe Standards, as they became known, required board members to undergo bias training, mandated diverse representation in leadership decisions, and created transparent processes for executive evaluations. Harvard Business School launched the Monroe Institute for Ethical Leadership, dedicated to training executives to recognize and combat systemic bias. The program's waiting list exceeded 10,000 applicants within months of its announcement. But Latrice's greatest achievement wasn't the institutional changes. It was the personal transformation she had undergone. The woman who had once defined herself by her corporate title had discovered a purpose far greater than any position could provide. She founded the Courage Leadership Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to mentoring Black women and minority entrepreneurs who aspired to executive positions. The foundation's programs included leadership development workshops, legal support for discrimination cases, and a network of successful executives who provided guidance and advocacy. I realized that my termination wasn't my ending, Latrice explained during a television interview. It was my beginning. They tried to silence one voice, but they accidentally amplified millions of others. The foundation's impact was immediate and profound. Within its first year, it had mentored over 500 aspiring leaders, provided legal support for 47 discrimination cases, and created a network of allies that spanned industries and continents. The legal precedent being set by Latrice's case was equally transformative. Employment attorneys were using her lawsuit as a template for challenging discriminatory practices in corporations nationwide. The documented evidence of bias that Marcus Tillman had compiled became a roadmap for other victims of workplace discrimination. But perhaps the most important lesson from Latrice Monroe's story wasn't about corporate governance or legal strategy. It was about the power of resilience in the face of injustice. First lesson: stand up to systemic injustice, even when it's easier to stay silent. Latrice could have accepted her termination, taken a settlement, and moved on quietly. Instead, she chose to fight back, knowing that her battle could help others facing similar discrimination. Second lesson: take immediate action when you witness wrongdoing. Marcus Tillman's legal team struck back within hours of her termination, not months later. Their swift response prevented the board from controlling the narrative and demonstrated that injustice would not be tolerated. Third lesson: community support can transform individual struggles into collective victories. The millions of people who rallied behind Latrice's cause proved that no one fights alone when they're fighting for what's right. Fourth lesson: betrayal can become purpose when you refuse to let it define you. Latrice transformed her pain into power, her devastation into determination, and her personal struggle into a platform for systemic change. The ripple effects of her courage continue to expand. Young women entering corporate America now have advocates, mentors, and legal precedents that didn't exist before. Board members think twice before making decisions based on bias rather than merit. Companies invest in diversity and inclusion programs that create real opportunities for underrepresented leaders. Every time a Black woman walks into a boardroom with confidence, she's walking in Latrice Monroe's footsteps. Every time a discriminatory practice is challenged, it's building on the foundation she established. Every time justice prevails over prejudice, it's honoring the sacrifice she made. The case is still making its way through the courts, but the verdict is already clear. Courage wins. Truth triumphs. Justice prevails. Your story doesn't end when others try to silence you. It begins when you refuse to be silenced. Take these lessons into your own life. Stand up for what's right. Support others who are fighting for justice. Turn your struggles into strength and your pain into purpose. Latrice Monroe's story proves that sometimes being forced out is just the beginning of your greatest impact.